Welcome to the real story of Caligula, the Roman emperor whose reign descended into such chaos and alleged depravity that it shocked even the Romans themselves. Forget the simplified version you might have encountered. The truth about Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus is far more complex and disturbing than most people realize. When Caligula ascended to power in 37 CE, at just 24 years old, Romans initially celebrated. Here was the beloved son of the popular general Germanicus, the boy who had charmed the legions as their mascot. The people expected a golden age. Instead, they got 4 years that would redefine tyranny. What happened next has puzzled historians for nearly 2 millennia. Within months of taking power, Caligula began displaying behavior so erratic and cruel that it defied explanation. Ancient sources describe a ruler who declared himself a living god, who reportedly made his horse a consul, and whose palace became a stage for increasingly bizarre and violent spectacles. But here's where it gets complicated, and why modern historians approach these claims with caution. The primary sources describing Caligula's reign come from writers like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, who wrote decades after his death and had clear political motivations to portray him as a monster. They needed to justify his assassination and contrast him with subsequent good emperors. Yet even accounting for exaggeration, something clearly went catastrophically wrong. Contemporary evidence suggests Caligula did engage in unprecedented displays of excess and cruelty. He emptied the imperial treasury on lavish spectacles and building projects. He humiliated senators, forcing them to run alongside his chariot for miles. He may have suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy or another neurological condition that affected his behavior, though this remains speculative. The palace intrigues described in ancient sources paint a picture of an environment where fear reigned supreme. Caligula allegedly used informants throughout Rome, creating an atmosphere of paranoia where a wrong word could mean death. Noble families lived in terror, never knowing when the emperor's whims might turn deadly. Perhaps most disturbing were the reports of his treatment of family members and close associates. Ancient sources claim he banished his sisters, had relationships that violated Roman taboos, and ordered executions for the slightest perceived slights. Whether these accounts are literally true or politically motivated exaggerations, they reflect the genuine terror his reign inspired. The emperor's end came swiftly. On January 24, 41 CE, members of the Praetorian Guard assassinated him in an underground corridor of his palace. His wife and infant daughter were murdered hours later, erasing his bloodline entirely. What makes Caligula's story so fascinating and troubling isn't just the alleged depravity, but how it reveals the fragility of absolute power and the danger of unchecked authority. In just 4 years, one man's descent into madness nearly brought the Roman Empire to its knees. Before we dive deeper into specific incidents from his reign, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. What aspect of ancient Roman politics fascinates you most? The psychological drama of absolute power never gets old, and Caligula's story is just the beginning. The transformation began subtly, then accelerated into horror. In the autumn of 37 CE, just 8 months after Caligula's triumphant ascension to power, something went catastrophically wrong. What happened during those crucial weeks in late 37 CE remains one of history's most debated mysteries, but its consequences would reshape the Roman Empire forever. Contemporary sources describe a sudden, severe illness that struck the young emperor without warning. Suetonius, writing decades later, suggests it was a fever so intense that it brought Caligula to death's door. Cassius Dio hints at something more sinister, perhaps poisoning by political rivals or a neurological episode that fundamentally altered his brain chemistry. Modern medical historians have proposed various theories. Temporal lobe epilepsy, which can cause dramatic personality changes and religious delusions, bipolar disorder, with its characteristic manic episodes, or even encephalitis, an inflammation of the brain that can trigger violent behavioral shifts. Whatever the cause, Romans across the empire prayed for their beloved emperor's recovery. Citizens held vigils, and some even pledged their own lives to the gods in exchange for his health. When news came that he had survived, celebrations erupted from Britain to Egypt. But the man who emerged from his sickbed was not the same person who had entered it. The change was immediately visible to those who knew him. Gone was the vibrant young leader who had once run alongside his father Germanicus's legions, earning the affectionate nickname Caligula, Little Boots, from the soldiers. In his place stood a man whose very presence seemed to radiate instability. His once athletic physique, honed through years of military training and public games, began to deteriorate rapidly. Court observers noted how his face became puffy and pale, his cheeks hollow despite increasing corpulence around his midsection. The transformation wasn't just from illness, it was from the lifestyle that followed. Endless banquets became the norm, with the emperor gorging himself on delicacies imported from across the empire while forcing guests to watch in uncomfortable silence. His personal hygiene, once exemplary by Roman standards, became a source of palace gossip. Servants whispered about the emperor's refusal to bathe regularly, instead dousing himself in expensive perfumes that created a sickly sweet cloud around his person. The scents, myrrh from Arabia, rose oil from Damascus, exotic spices from India, became associated with fear rather than luxury, as courtiers learned to recognize the emperor's approach by smell alone. Most disturbing was what happened to his eyes. Multiple sources described the unsettling intensity of Caligula's gaze after his illness. Where once there had been warmth and intelligence, there now burned what Seneca called a fire that consumed reason itself. Palace attendants reported how the emperor would fix his stare on individuals for uncomfortably long periods, as if seeing through them to something beyond mortal comprehension. The physical changes paled in comparison to the psychological transformation. The young man who had once charmed senators with his wit and won over crowds with his accessibility became increasingly unpredictable and cruel. His sleep patterns, according to palace records, became chaotic. Servants reported finding him wandering the corridors at all hours, sometimes naked, sometimes dressed in elaborate costumes he had designed himself. These midnight wanderings became legendary among the palace staff. Guards described encountering the emperor having animated conversations with statues of the gods, or sitting alone in darkened rooms, laughing at jokes only he could hear. Sometimes he would stand at windows for hours, claiming he was receiving divine instructions. Other times, he would suddenly appear in servants' quarters, demanding they join him for impromptu feasts that could last until dawn. His relationship with reality became increasingly tenuous. While Roman emperors had always claimed divine favor, Caligula began insisting on his literal godhood with unprecedented fervor. He ordered that statues of various gods be beheaded so that his likeness could be attached to their bodies. He demanded that citizens worship him not as a representative of divine will, but as a deity in his own right. Those closest to Caligula watched this transformation with growing alarm. His sisters, once his confidants, began to distance themselves as his behavior became more erratic. Longtime advisors found themselves walking on ever thinner ice, never knowing which comment might trigger an explosive rage or, worse, a calm decree of execution. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite imperial bodyguards, began to exchange worried glances during public appearances. These were men who had sworn to protect the emperor with their lives, but they were witnessing the systematic destruction of everything they had pledged to defend. Palace freedmen, former slaves who often wielded significant influence, started developing their own informal networks to survive the increasingly dangerous atmosphere. Senators, the traditional aristocracy of Rome, found themselves in an impossible position. Roman law and custom demanded their deference to imperial authority, But that same authority was now being exercised in ways that violated every principle of Roman governance. They watched in horror as their emperor began making decisions that seemed designed purely to humiliate and terrorize rather than govern effectively. By 39 CE, just 2 years after his mysterious illness, the transformation was complete. Contemporary accounts describe a man who bore little resemblance to the promising young leader who had once inspired such hope. His hair, once thick and dark, had begun to thin prematurely, possibly from stress, poor diet, or the various treatments he subjected himself to in pursuit of his divine status. His face, according to surviving busts and contemporary descriptions, had lost its youthful appeal. The strong jawline remained, but it was now set in a perpetual expression of suspicion and cruelty. His skin, once bronzed from outdoor activities, became sallow and marked by the excesses of his new lifestyle. Perhaps most tragically, his voice, once described as clear and commanding, became affected and theatrical. He began speaking in different tones and accents, sometimes claiming to channel various gods, other times adopting what he believed were the mannerisms of divine beings. This vocal transformation became another source of unease for those who remembered the articulate young man he had been. The emperor who had once been Rome's brightest hope had become its darkest nightmare, and the worst was yet to come. The physical and mental deterioration that began with his mysterious illness in 37 CE would accelerate into behaviors so extreme that they would shock even the Romans, a people not easily disturbed by displays of power and excess. What happened next would test the very foundations of the Roman political system and demonstrate just how much damage one unhinged individual could inflict when given absolute power over the known world. The transformation of the Palatine Hill from Rome's most sacred seat of power into what ancient sources describe as a theater of degradation represents one of history's most dramatic examples of how absolute authority can corrupt absolutely. What emerged from Caligula's psychological breakdown wasn't just personal excess. It was a systematic campaign of political terrorism disguised as imperial entertainment. The physical transformation of the imperial palace began almost immediately after Caligula's recovery from his mysterious illness. What had once been a relatively restrained complex, designed to project dignity and gravitas, became an elaborate stage set for the emperor's increasingly theatrical displays of power. According to contemporary accounts, Caligula ordered extensive renovations that would have shocked previous emperors. Traditional Roman architectural principles emphasized order, symmetry, and republican virtue, even under imperial rule. Caligula's modifications threw these conventions aside in favor of spaces designed for spectacle and intimidation. New chambers were constructed specifically for what the sources euphemistically call entertainments. These rooms, according to Suetonius and other contemporary historians, were designed with specific psychological purposes in mind. Some featured hidden passages that allowed the emperor to appear and disappear at will, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance. Others included elaborate staging areas where guests could be displayed for the amusement or horror of other attendees. The most notorious additions were what palace servants called the private chambers, rooms that could be sealed from the outside, trapping guests inside until the emperor decided to release them. These spaces, draped in expensive fabrics from across the empire, became symbols of the new reality. Luxury and terror intertwined in ways that previous Roman rulers had never imagined. Understanding Caligula's palace entertainments requires recognizing them not as random acts of depravity, but as calculated exercises in political control. Every guest list was carefully curated, every humiliation precisely targeted, every act of degradation designed to serve larger strategic purposes. The emperor's treatment of senators' wives exemplifies this systematic approach. By forcing prominent women into compromising situations while their husbands watched helplessly, Caligula accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. He demonstrated his absolute power over Rome's traditional elite. He created blackmail material that could be used to ensure future compliance, and he psychologically destroyed potential opposition by attacking their most fundamental source of honor, their ability to protect their families. These weren't spontaneous acts of lust, as some later moralistic historians would claim. They were carefully orchestrated demonstrations of imperial authority that struck at the heart of Roman social structures. In a culture where a man's honor was intimately connected to his ability to protect his household, forcing senators to witness or participate in their wives' humiliation was perhaps the most effective possible method of political castration. The alleged relationships with his sisters, Drusilla and Agrippina, served similar functions. Whether these relationships were literally incestuous or merely staged to appear so, they served to place Caligula outside normal human social bonds. By violating the most fundamental taboos of Roman society, he positioned himself as existing beyond mortal law, a living god whose desires transcended human morality. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these palace gatherings was how they transformed Rome's elite from potential opponents into unwilling accomplices. Ancient sources describe a carefully crafted atmosphere where refusal to participate wasn't simply dangerous, it was impossible. Guests arriving at imperial gatherings never knew what they would encounter. Some evenings might feature relatively conventional entertainment, elaborate theatrical performances, exotic cuisine, or displays of gladiatorial skill. But others descended into what contemporary accounts describe as organized humiliation campaigns targeting specific individuals or families. This unpredictability was itself a weapon. Senators and their families couldn't simply refuse imperial invitations. Such refusal would be interpreted as treason. But accepting meant potential exposure to situations that could destroy their reputations and their family's honor. The emperor had created a perfect trap. Participation meant complicity, but refusal meant death. The psychological impact on Rome's ruling class was devastating. Men who had once seen themselves as partners in governance, heirs to the republican tradition that had built the empire, found themselves reduced to helpless observers of their own degradation. Women from the most prominent families discovered that their status provided no protection against imperial whims. Palace staff, from the highest-ranking freedmen to the lowliest slaves, found themselves in an impossible position. They were simultaneously witnesses to the emperor's activities and potential victims of his paranoia. Their testimonies, preserved in later historical accounts, provide some of the most disturbing glimpses into daily life under Caligula's rule. Servants described an atmosphere of constant fear, where any perceived slight, real or imagined, could result in immediate execution. They witnessed scenes that violated every norm of Roman society, but speaking about them, even among themselves, carried deadly risks. The emperor's network of informants extended throughout the palace hierarchy, creating an environment where survival depended on absolute discretion. These staff members also became unwilling participants in Caligula's psychological games. They were forced to prepare rooms for activities they found abhorrent, to serve food and wine to guests they knew were being systematically humiliated, and to clean up the aftermath of events that left participants traumatized and broken. Some servants, according to later accounts, developed elaborate strategies for psychological survival. They learned to become invisible, to anticipate the emperor's moods, and to navigate the constantly shifting dynamics of palace life. Others broke under the pressure, leading to frequent staff turnover that itself became a source of instability and paranoia. The transformation of imperial hospitality into political terrorism had consequences that extended far beyond the palace walls. Word of what occurred during these gatherings spread throughout Rome's political class, creating an atmosphere of dread that paralyzed effective governance. Senators began avoiding each other socially, fearful that any association might be interpreted as conspiracy. Families withdrew from public life, hoping that invisibility might provide protection from imperial attention. The traditional networks of patronage and alliance that had sustained Roman politics for centuries began to collapse under the weight of mutual suspicion and fear. This social breakdown served Caligula's purposes perfectly. By destroying the bonds of trust and mutual obligation that held Rome's elite together, he eliminated their capacity for organized resistance. Individual senators might harbor resentment, but they lacked the social infrastructure necessary to transform that resentment into effective opposition. The emperor had discovered something that would be rediscovered by totalitarian rulers throughout history. Systematic humiliation and degradation can be more effective tools of control than simple violence. Dead opponents become martyrs, but broken opponents become cautionary tales that discourage others from resistance. As we'll see in the next phase of Caligula's reign, this weaponization of imperial entertainment was just the beginning of a broader campaign that would test the very foundations of Roman civilization and demonstrate just how much damage one unhinged ruler could inflict on the ancient world's greatest empire. What distinguished Caligula from other tyrannical rulers throughout history wasn't simply his capacity for violence. It was his sophisticated understanding of how to break the human spirit without necessarily breaking the body. The emperor who had emerged from his mysterious illness possessed an almost supernatural ability to identify and exploit psychological vulnerabilities, turning Rome's most powerful citizens into trembling shadows of their former selves. Caligula's approach to psychological torture revealed a mind that understood power dynamics with frightening clarity. Unlike previous emperors who might have simply executed political opponents, Caligula recognized that broken enemies were more valuable than dead ones. A corpse could inspire martyrdom and resistance. A humiliated survivor served as a living warning to others. His treatment of the Senate exemplifies this calculated approach. These were men who had spent their entire lives accumulating honor, dignity, and respect, the fundamental currencies of Roman political life. Caligula systematically attacked these psychological foundations, creating scenarios where senators faced impossible choices between physical survival and spiritual death. The banquet humiliations described by contemporary sources weren't random acts of sadism. They were carefully orchestrated performances designed to achieve specific psychological objectives. By forcing senators to dance, an activity associated with slaves and entertainers, Caligula stripped them of their most fundamental identity markers. In Roman culture, a senator's dignity was considered almost sacred. To see grown men of consular rank reduced to gyrating for imperial amusement was to witness the collapse of an entire social order. The foot-kissing rituals served an even more specific purpose. In Roman political tradition, the act of prostration was reserved for interactions with gods or barbarian kings. It was explicitly un-Roman. By forcing senators to perform these acts, Caligula was literally rewriting the relationship between ruler and ruled, transforming Roman citizens into Oriental subjects. Perhaps nowhere was Caligula's psychological sophistication more evident than in his treatment of those closest to him. His relationships with family members and intimate partners became laboratories for testing the limits of human endurance and loyalty. The case of his sister Drusilla represents one of the most complex aspects of his psychological campaign. Whether their relationship was actually incestuous or merely staged to appear so, Caligula used it as a weapon against traditional Roman values, while simultaneously creating a prison for Drusilla herself. She became both accomplice and victim, elevated to unprecedented status while living under constant threat. Contemporary sources describe Drusilla's final months as a study in psychological deterioration. Palace servants reported that she rarely left her chambers, that she started at sudden noises, and that she seemed to age years in the span of months. Her death in 38 CE, whether from natural causes, suicide, or murder, came as a relief to observers who had watched her transformation from imperial princess to terrified prisoner. The emperor's reaction to her death revealed another layer of his psychological complexity. Rather than displaying grief, he declared her a goddess and established an official cult in her honor. This wasn't love, it was the ultimate act of possession, claiming ownership over her very soul and using her deification as another tool of political control. Caligula's treatment of his wives, particularly Milonia Caesonia, demonstrated how he could weaponize even the most intimate human relationships. Marriage, traditionally a source of private comfort and public alliance in Roman society, became another arena for imperial terrorism. Caesonia's ordeal began even before their marriage. Contemporary accounts describe how Caligula deliberately courted her while she was married to another man, not out of passion, but as a demonstration of his power to take whatever he desired. Her eventual divorce and remarriage to the emperor wasn't a romantic triumph. It was a public announcement that no Roman institution was beyond imperial violation. The public humiliations that followed their marriage served multiple purposes. By parading Caesonia naked before his guards, Caligula wasn't simply satisfying voyeuristic impulses. He was systematically destroying her capacity for resistance. Each degradation made her more dependent on his protection, more willing to endure the next humiliation rather than face the consequences of rebellion. Perhaps most cruelly, he forced her to participate in the humiliation of others. Palace records suggest that Caesonia was compelled to help orchestrate the degradation of other noble women, making her complicit in the very system that was destroying her. This technique, forcing victims to become perpetrators, would be rediscovered by totalitarian regimes throughout history as one of the most effective methods of psychological control. Caligula's treatment of discarded lovers and their families revealed the economic dimensions of his psychological campaign. When he tired of romantic partners, he didn't simply end the relationships. He transformed breakups into elaborate exercises in terror that served broader political purposes. The process typically began with accusations of treason or adultery, charges that were impossible to disprove and carried automatic death sentences. But execution was rarely immediate. Instead, victims were forced to endure prolonged trials where their former intimacy with the emperor became evidence of their guilt. Love letters became treasonous correspondence. Private conversations became seditious plotting. The family destruction that followed served as both punishment and deterrent. By selling children into slavery and executing relatives, Caligula ensured that his victims' suffering extended beyond their own deaths. More importantly, he created object lessons for other potential lovers. Intimacy with the emperor was temporary, but the consequences were permanent. One particularly documented case involves a noble woman whose name has been lost to history, but whose fate was recorded by multiple contemporary sources. After refusing Caligula's advances at a palace gathering, she found herself charged with conspiracy. Her husband was executed for failing to control his wife. Her sons were sold to gladiatorial schools, and her daughters disappeared into the imperial brothels. She herself was exiled to a barren island where she lived for years as a beggar, her survival serving as a constant reminder of the price of defiance. The impact of Caligula's psychological campaigns extended far beyond their immediate victims. Roman society, built on networks of marriage alliances, family connections, and social obligations, began to fracture under the pressure of systematic emotional terrorism. Families stopped arranging marriages with imperial connections, recognizing that proximity to power had become more dangerous than beneficial. Parents began sending their daughters away from Rome rather than risk imperial attention. Some noble families reportedly began practicing primitive forms of what we might now call gray man techniques, deliberately making themselves less attractive less noticeable, less likely to catch the emperor's eye. The psychological destruction of Rome's elite created a cascade effect throughout the empire. Provincial governors, lacking clear direction from a paralyzed senate, began making increasingly independent decisions. Military commanders, uncertain about the stability of imperial authority, started building personal loyalties that bypassed traditional chains of command. What made Caligula's psychological terrorism so effective was its inescapable logic. Resistance led to destruction, but compliance led to degradation. Victims found themselves trapped in a system where every choice was wrong. Every response played into the emperor's hands. This psychological trap extended beyond individual victims to Roman society as a whole. The empire that had conquered the known world through discipline, honor, and civic virtue found itself paralyzed by an emperor who had weaponized these very qualities against their possessors. As we'll see in the final phase of Caligula's reign, this systematic destruction of Roman psychological and social infrastructure would ultimately create the conditions for his own downfall, but not before inflicting damage that would echo through the empire for generations to come. The psychological terrorism that had begun with palace entertainments and intimate humiliations soon metastasized into something far more systematic and terrifying. A comprehensive surveillance apparatus that transformed the Roman Empire into history's first documented police state. What Caligula created in those final years of his reign would serve as a template for authoritarian control that wouldn't be matched in scope and sophistication until the 20th century. The transformation of the imperial palace from a seat of government into a surveillance center began with architectural modifications that revealed Caligula's increasingly sophisticated understanding of power and control. The secret passages and hidden observation posts described by Suetonius weren't random additions. They were components of a carefully designed system for monitoring and controlling human behavior. Palace engineers, working under conditions of absolute secrecy, constructed an elaborate network of concealed corridors that honeycombed the imperial residence. These passages served multiple functions. They allowed the emperor to appear unexpectedly in any room. They provided escape routes in case of attack, and most importantly, they created a comprehensive eavesdropping network that could monitor conversations throughout the complex. The hidden slits in walls weren't simply voyeuristic indulgences. They were strategic observation points that allowed systematic intelligence gathering. Contemporary accounts suggest that teams of trained observers, many of them freed slaves with exceptional memories, were stationed behind these concealed vantage points during important gatherings. Their job was to record not just conversations, but facial expressions, body language, and social interactions that might reveal potential conspiracies or disloyalty. Perhaps most ingeniously, Caligula had the palace's acoustic properties modified to enhance surveillance capabilities. Certain rooms were designed with peculiar sound qualities that amplified whispered conversations, carrying them through hidden channels to listening posts where imperial spies could record every word. Guests who thought they were speaking privately found their most intimate conversations becoming evidence in treason trials weeks later. The physical surveillance infrastructure was only as effective as the human intelligence network that supported it. Caligula's genius, if it can be called that, lay in his systematic corruption of Rome's traditional social bonds, transforming every relationship into a potential source of intelligence. The emperor's approach to recruiting informants revealed a deep understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. Rather than relying solely on paid agents, he created conditions where betrayal became a survival strategy. Servants weren't simply bribed to spy on their masters. They were placed in situations where failure to report suspicious behavior would itself be treated as treason. This system created what modern intelligence analysts would recognize as a double-bind scenario. Loyal servants who refused to inform on their masters became suspects themselves, while those who cooperated found themselves trapped in an ever-expanding web of complicity. Once someone had provided information leading to another person's punishment, they became permanently compromised, forced to continue cooperating to avoid being exposed as informants. The corruption of senatorial relationships proved even more devastating to Rome's political culture. Senators who had served together for decades, who had intermarried their families and shared political alliances spanning generations, suddenly found themselves forced to choose between personal survival and institutional loyalty. The emperor's technique was particularly cruel. He would privately approach individual senators with evidence of their colleagues' disloyalty, forcing them to either confirm suspicions or risk being labeled co-conspirators. What made Caligula's surveillance state so effective wasn't just its comprehensiveness, but its psychological impact on both watchers and watched. The emperor had discovered that the mere possibility of observation could be more powerful than actual surveillance, creating a climate of self-censorship and behavioral modification that extended far beyond the palace walls. Palace residents began modifying their behavior in ways that would be familiar to anyone who has lived under totalitarian rule. Conversations became guarded and formal, even between close friends. Facial expressions were carefully controlled, as servants and courtiers learned that a moment of unguarded reaction could be interpreted as seditious. Even sleep became fitful, as the emperor's nocturnal wanderings meant that no hour was safe from potential observation. The psychological toll on the watchers themselves was equally severe. Informants found themselves isolated from normal social relationships, trusted by neither their handlers nor their former associates. Many developed what contemporary sources describe as nervous ailments, what we might now recognize as symptoms of chronic stress and moral injury. Some reportedly committed suicide rather than continue their roles in the surveillance apparatus. The emperor's own psychological state deteriorated under the weight of the system he had created. The sword under his pillow, mentioned by multiple sources, wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of his complete inability to trust anyone, including his own bodyguards. Palace servants reported finding him awake at all hours, reviewing intelligence reports and plotting responses to threats that existed only in his increasingly paranoid imagination. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Caligula's surveillance state was its interpretive apparatus, the system by which innocent behaviors were transformed into evidence of treason. The emperor and his intelligence analysts developed an elaborate methodology for reading seditious intent into the most mundane activities. The execution of the senator who whispered, "He's mad," demonstrates this interpretive process in action. The comment itself, while disrespectful, was hardly unique in Roman political discourse. Previous emperors had endured far worse criticism without resorting to execution. But Caligula's system transformed private criticism into public conspiracy by applying a paranoid logic that saw every expression of doubt as evidence of organized resistance. The case of young Tiberius Gemellus reveals the system's ultimate horror, its ability to criminalize involuntary biological functions. The boy's cough, interpreted as suspicious by imperial intelligence analysts, became evidence of his unreliability and potential threat. This wasn't simply arbitrary cruelty. It was the logical endpoint of a surveillance system that had convinced itself that any deviation from perfect compliance indicated treacherous intent. The interpretive guidelines developed during this period would have seemed familiar to victims of 20th-century show trials. Physical symptoms became evidence of guilty consciences. Social connections indicated conspiracy networks. Even demonstrated loyalty was suspect, as it might be a cover for deeper treachery. The surveillance techniques pioneered in the imperial palace quickly spread throughout the Roman governmental system. Provincial governors, seeking to demonstrate their loyalty to the emperor, began implementing similar intelligence networks in their territories. Military commanders started monitoring their own officers, creating command structures paralyzed by mutual suspicion. The economic impact was devastating. Trade relationships, built on trust and personal connections, began to collapse as merchants feared that business disputes might be interpreted as political opposition. Families stopped visiting Rome, recognizing that proximity to power had become more dangerous than profitable. Even religious activities came under scrutiny, as gatherings of any kind were potential covers for seditious plotting. Most tragically, the surveillance state began consuming itself. Informants informed on other informants. Intelligence analysts found themselves under investigation, and even the emperor's most trusted agents discovered that their access to sensitive information made them threats to imperial security. By the final year of Caligula's reign, the surveillance apparatus had become so pervasive and paranoid that it threatened the basic functioning of Roman government. Senators stopped attending meetings for fear of being observed in suspicious conversations. Military officers hesitated to communicate with each other, even about routine matters. The very system designed to protect imperial authority was strangling the empire's ability to govern itself. The emperor had achieved something unprecedented in Roman history, a state where loyalty was indistinguishable from treachery, where safety lay only in complete isolation, and where the machinery of government had been replaced by the machinery of suspicion. It was a system that could only end in one of two ways: the complete collapse of Roman civilization, or the violent removal of the emperor who had created it. As events would prove, even the most sophisticated surveillance state cannot protect a ruler from the ultimate consequence of absolute paranoia: the recognition by those charged with his protection that he had become a greater threat to the state than any external enemy. By January 41 CE, the surveillance state that Caligula had constructed with such meticulous care had become his own prison. The emperor, who had systematically destroyed trust throughout the Roman Empire, discovered that he had created conditions where even his most intimate protectors could no longer distinguish between loyalty and survival. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite imperial bodyguards, faced an impossible contradiction. Their oath required them to protect an emperor whose continued existence threatened the very empire they had sworn to defend. The plot against Caligula wasn't born from political ambition or ideological opposition. It emerged from the simple recognition that the imperial system itself had become unsustainable. The conspirators, led by Praetorian tribune Cassius Chaerea, represented not a faction seeking power, but a cross-section of Roman society united only by their shared desperation to escape the nightmare their world had become. What made this conspiracy particularly significant was its spontaneous nature. Unlike traditional Roman political plots, which typically involved months of careful planning and alliance building, Caligula's assassination emerged from the immediate recognition that the emperor's psychological deterioration had reached a point where delay meant collective destruction. The surveillance apparatus that should have protected him instead provided the conspirators with detailed intelligence about his movements and vulnerabilities. The choice of location, a narrow palace corridor, reflected the conspirators' understanding that they had only one opportunity. There would be no second chance, no possibility of retreat or negotiation. The emperor's paranoia had eliminated all alternatives except total success or total destruction. The assassination itself, described by Cassius Dio and other contemporary sources, revealed the accumulated fury of years of systematic humiliation and terror. The 30 stab wounds weren't simply the result of multiple conspirators. They represented the explosive release of rage that had been building throughout Roman society since Caligula's transformation began. The frenzied nature of the attack suggests something beyond political necessity. Each blow carried the weight of specific grievances: senators forced to dance like slaves, wives paraded naked before guards, children murdered for suspicious coughs, families destroyed for imagined treasons. The conspirators weren't simply killing an emperor. They were symbolically destroying the entire apparatus of psychological terrorism he had created. The immediate execution of Caesonia and the infant daughter represents perhaps the most tragic aspect of the conspiracy's aftermath. These killings weren't driven by personal animosity toward the victims, but by the recognition that Caligula's reign had poisoned the very concept of imperial succession. The conspirators understood that any heir, however innocent, would become a focal point for the resurrection of the terror state they had just destroyed. The destruction of Caligula's corpse and the scattering of his ashes reflected a sophisticated understanding of Roman political psychology. The conspirators recognized that martyrdom could be as dangerous as tyranny, that Caligula's supporters might transform his death into a rallying cry for revenge. By denying him a proper burial and eliminating all physical traces of his existence, they attempted to erase not just the man, but the entire historical moment he represented. The reported hauntings and ghostly appearances in the palace, whether literal truth or psychological projection, demonstrated the lasting trauma of Caligula's reign. Rome had experienced something unprecedented, a ruler who had weaponized the most fundamental human relationships and transformed the seat of imperial power into a theater of systematic degradation. The psychological scars couldn't be eliminated as easily as physical remains. The immediate aftermath of the assassination revealed the extent of institutional damage Caligula had inflicted. The Senate, supposedly Rome's governing body, found itself paralyzed by years of systematic humiliation and terror. Senators who had survived by becoming expert at reading imperial moods and avoiding dangerous opinions discovered they had lost the capacity for independent political judgment. The financial crisis was equally severe. Caligula's extravagances had drained the imperial treasury, but more fundamentally, his reign had disrupted the economic relationships that sustained the empire. Trade networks built on trust and personal relationships required years to rebuild. Provincial governments, having operated in isolation due to the breakdown of central authority, had developed independent power bases that complicated imperial administration. Perhaps most tragically, Roman society had lost its capacity for normal political discourse. Citizens had spent 4 years learning to view every interaction through the lens of potential surveillance and betrayal. The social bonds that had sustained Roman civilization, patron-client relationships, family alliances, collegial friendships, had been systematically corrupted by the emperor's intelligence apparatus. Caligula's transformation from Rome's golden boy to history's paradigmatic tyrant served as a permanent warning about the fragility of civilized society. His reign demonstrated how quickly sophisticated political institutions could be corrupted by unchecked power, and how individuals' psychological breakdown could cascade into civilizational crisis. The name Caligula would indeed become synonymous with the ultimate corruption of authority, but his true historical significance lies not in his individual cruelties, but in his systematic destruction of the social and political infrastructure that made Roman greatness possible. His 4-year reign provided a template for authoritarian control that would be studied and imitated by aspiring tyrants throughout history. The emperor who had declared himself a living god ultimately achieved a different kind of immortality. He became Rome's permanent cautionary tale about what happens when power recognizes no limits, and when the machinery of government becomes indistinguishable from the machinery of terror. So, there's the real Caligula, not the glamorous emperor of myth, but a paranoid, depraved tyrant who turned his palace into a nightmare of lust and terror. His S3x dungeon wasn't just a scandal. It was a symbol of a reign so corrupt it poisoned Rome itself. From his rotting mind to his blood-soaked end, Caligula's story is a warning. Give a man absolute power, and he'll turn a palace into a prison, a court into a slaughterhouse. The next time you hear his name romanticized in a movie, remember the senators forced to grovel, the lovers tortured for his amusement, and the empire left in ashes. This is what unchecked power looks like, a monster wearing a crown. Drop a comment. What shocked you most about Caligula's reign? And subscribe for more dark history that'll keep you up at night.